Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Audrey Lichter, Executive Director of Chai Mitzvah, the Resource Center for Jewish Engagement. Today's Scholars Circle topic is From Washington to Jerusalem, the Dynamics of U.S. Israel Relations, featuring Dr. Eli Saltzman. Chai Mitzvah is a national organization now celebrating its 16th year. We are the sponsor of Scholars Circle and a resource center that focuses on building community through Jewish engagement programs. We have over 20 curricula to choose from for small group conversation, for teens and adults, lay and professionally led. For more information, please visit our website at chaimitzvah.org. The Scholars Circle program was inspired by Scott Shea. Scott is our founder and board president, who authored a best-selling book, Conspiracy U, a case study, which unpacks anti-Zionist conspiracy theories from the left and the right of the political spectrum. You can purchase Scott's book, along with accompanying curriculum, wherever books are sold, and also on our website at chaimitzvah.org. The curriculum was also taught in a recorded series by Dr. Andrew Pessin. You will receive all this information in our follow-up email as well. The Scholars Circle hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture will have a resource guide that will be sent to you after each lecture. A recording of all our lectures are accessible on our website and shared with you through email. We are excited to continue the Scholars Circle program, and we need your support to keep it running. Scholars Circle has engaged nearly 3,000 participants since 10/7. Your donation will enable us to continue bringing international scholars to you at no charge to share their expertise on the evolving Jewish world in the aftermath of October 7th. Please help us reach our goal of $40,000. To make a donation, please visit chaimitzvah.org and click on the gold menu tab, Scholars Circle, and select Support Scholars Circle. This will be included in our follow-up email as well. And thank you for considering supporting this engaging program for all. Our featured scholar tonight is Dr. Saltzman, an Associate Research Professor of Israel Studies and the Director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. His scholarship and teaching focus on international security, Israel foreign and security policy, U.S. foreign policy, and political psychology. Dr. Saltzman is the author of Scrutinizing Balance of Power Theory, a polymorphic reconceptualization. He has also written numerous scholarly articles and book chapters, as well as commentaries in the Los Angeles Times, Haaretz, the Jerusalem Post, and other prominent outlets. Dr. Saltzman earned his PhD in International Relations in 2010 from the University of Haifa and was a postdoctoral research fellow at the International Security Program, ISP, Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, John F. Kennedy School of Government, and Harvard University. Before I welcome our scholar, a couple of housekeeping items. To submit questions, please use the Q&A button on your screen. Q&A will be held in about 40 minutes into the lecture, but you can submit questions anytime throughout. The lecture recording will be sent to your email in a few days and will be available on our website at chaimitzvah.org. And now to Dr. Saltzman.
Thank you so much, Audrey, for this lovely, lovely introduction. And I apologize for the title of my first book. Sometimes you need a very strong editor to hold an author in account. I'd like to thank you for inviting me. I would like to thank Simon Lichter, and I'm looking forward to this conversation today. I'm just going to share my screen with the viewers, and I think you should be fine here. Give me one more second. There you go. Alrighty, so a quick disclaimer in a sense. My comments today do not reflect the views of the university or the Gildenhorn Institute but only my own analysis of the topic at hand. I will speak for about 35 minutes. And then we'll open the floor for Q&A, as Audrey just said, which is, Q&A is always my favorite part of any talk that I give. So I'm looking forward to engaging the audience. I'll start by saying that we can dedicate a whole semester to address the topic, which is something that I actually do at the University of Maryland. And I did earlier today in class. I will do my best to present a sensible analysis of U.S. Israel relations, and we can certainly revisit some of the points during the Q&A part. Keep in mind that I have more than 654 slides, so let's not waste any more time. There you go. We're going to start. So one of the things that I want to start with is that the U.S.-Israel relationship actually poses a puzzle. And by that, I mean it kind of poses a question, a scholarly question that people have been grappling for decades now. And in fact, we are talking about two interrelated questions that are very interesting, that I find, at least personally, very interesting. One is, what is the American interest in maintaining such an intimate and close relationship over time and space? Despite the changes in the names and ideologies of the leaders of both countries, the relationship has remained very close nevertheless. From an Israeli perspective, however, it's a no-brainer. The United States provides a variety of benefits. This relationship provides a variety of benefits. First of all, it is a partnership with a superpower, a very powerful, very strong, and influential actor in international affairs. There's also a kind of technical, perhaps, or strategic element there. The United States was able, over the years, to preserve or to maintain and support Israel's qualitative military edge. In other words, the United States was a provider of the most advanced capabilities ever on the market. It also provides significant diplomatic support in the United Nations and other international forums. There's a very strong and powerful connection between Israel and the American Jewish community, obviously. And there's also kind of a civilizational affinity there. When Israel looks to the east, it sees adversaries, enemies, a very non-hospitable environment whereas when it looks to the west, and especially the US, it sees something that it wants to create connections with. So what about the United States? We can talk about a partnership that was, I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but was created certainly in the shadow of a Cold War, a global, worldwide conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. There's significant mutually beneficial security cooperation between the two countries. I'm going to talk about that. Israel is a bastion of democracy in the Middle East. These are kindled spirits. I'll talk about that as well. And Israel, for the most part, it is a very reliable provider of all kinds of benefits and perks for the United States. The second puzzle is, how do we define this relationship? And there are basically 5 types of relationships that we can kind of use to characterize this bilateral association or alignment, if you'd like. We can talk about military alliances, but these are mostly formal. You need an agreement for mutual defense, something like Article 5 in the NATO treaty or something, does not exist here. Some scholars talk about a hierarchical and transactional relationship with benefits for both parties, a patron-client relationship. Others focus on the informal strategic cooperation between the two, otherwise known as an alignment. Some scholars focus on the asymmetrical relationship when it comes to power dynamics and the interests in the region. And last but not least, a lot of scholars talk about the special relationship between the United States and Israel. So these are very close ties that go above and beyond shared interests. Well, the relationship was not special from the get-go. This is actually a class that I taught today. And you can see 2 examples. Harry Truman, President of the United States in the late 40s, was one of the first to extend recognition to the newly created state of Israel, but it was a very caveated, kind of limited sort of recognition. It is de facto, and it took him about a year or so until January 1949 to extend de jure or full legal actual recognition. And the reason is that, in addition to the fact that there was no elected government in Israel by 1948, it was a temporary or transition government of sorts. There were some other regional interests that the United States was trying to maintain, and a full-blown recognition, at least at the first few months, was something that was not something the United States was willing to do. There was a lot of debates both between State Department, Department of Defense, and the White House. Um, Dwight Eisenhower had a very even-handed approach to Israel and the Arab-Israeli conflict. He tried to play um, a very, very non-biased, neutral role in the region, to rely heavily on the United Nations. And I'll show you a bunch of quotes. The special relationship basically started in the early 1960s. And this is John Kennedy's quote when he met Foreign Minister Golda Meir. And this is not in the White House, obviously. The meeting took place in a private residence in Palm Beach, Florida. And he says that Israel and the United States have a special relationship that is only comparable to what Britain and the UK have between the two of them, which is a pretty significant, very, very interesting comment to make. And again, this asymmetry of power, asymmetry of interest is something that scholars like myself are very much puzzled by. It is not clear. But regardless of that, once you move forward, you can see that whether it was Nixon or Carter, they all spoke about a very special relationship between these two countries. They share a special bond, Bill Clinton said. At this point, the alliance is significant. There are deep bonds, my apologies, between these two, of friendship, and so on and so forth. Trump first, I make this promise to you, my administration will always stand with Israel. Unequivocal, very supportive, very strong. Joe Biden, the connection between the Israeli people and the American people is bone deep, he said. And most recently, just a few weeks ago, the bonds of friendship and affection between the American and Israeli people have endured for generations, and they are absolutely unbreakable. So this is a very significant comment made by the US president. So what are the pillars of this special relationship? And again, keep in mind that it's not just about strategic interests. Certainly, the first part, the strategic interests, were forged during the Cold War. And the idea was to try to contain Soviet influence in the Middle East, or to try to curb Arab regional aspirations, especially Egyptian, but otherwise to prevent kind of a hegemonic Arab or Soviet presence in the Middle East. It is about trying to maintain regional stability, prevent radical regimes or religious movements from emerging or taking control of the region. The idea was to try to take care of nuclear proliferation down the road. There's a significant, robust security cooperation between the two countries. They share intelligence, they hold joint exercises, they learn from one another, they test new weapon systems, and they are very much interested in maintaining open waterways, including the Suez Canal or the Red Sea. They also shared democratic values. Both American and Israeli leaders oftentimes make reference to Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East, something that the United States cares deeply about. The ideological affinity makes the connection stronger and deeper than with any other autocratic, non-democratic regime in the region. Israel is an open, liberal, tolerant society. We'll talk about what kind and if that remains the case today, but certainly it is perceived by the United States and certainly by the American people as a very, very strong democratic ally of the United States in the Middle East. There's also a Judeo-Christian tradition that goes down and deep in American history. It's not just about Jews and Christians, but also a way to contrast Jews and Christians and separate them to some extent from other religions in the region, especially Islam. You can talk about the founding fathers and the Old Testament. You can talk about personal experiences, and I like to tell this particular anecdote from Abraham Lincoln, who told a Canadian Zionist friend that establishing a Jewish national home in Palestine was a noble dream and one shared by many Americans. I myself have regarded the Jews, he said. My pediatrist is a Jew, and he also many times put me on my leg, that I would have no objection to giving him, his countrymen, a leg up. Kind of a pun. There's also a shared ethos the United States and Israel are considering, at least in their own eyes, a shining city on the hill, or American exceptionalism that is aligned with or pretty much mirroring the Jewish light onto the nations idea. Israel and the United States, to a large extent, are also frontier states, both fighting for their existence in a hostile environment. Certainly, Israel today, the United States during the first couple of decades, the Civil War, and so on and so forth, the move to the West, and so on. It is also an immigrant society. The United States is a multicultural society. In Israel, a melting pot of multiple groups and ethnic groups that came from all across the world. There's also public opinion that is very strong, still very powerful, and very much in favor of Israel. I'll talk about some changes there. But Americans, when they are asked, who do you support more, Israel or the Palestinians or the Arabs, for the most part, about 60% say the Israelis. And we'll talk about the breakdown, certainly some of the changes today. So what does it look like in practice? Well, for starters, it means that the United States supports Israel diplomatically or politically, if you wish, especially in the United Nations. The United States has vetoed resolutions critical of Israel more than any other council member, 40 times as of December 2023. In comparison, the United States vetoed 89 Security Council resolutions in total since 1945. So about half is dedicated to the state of Israel. Moreover, recently, the United States and the Trump administration imposed sanctions on the International Criminal Court after a special prosecutor issued arrest warrants against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Minister of Defense, my apologies, Yoav Gallant. The United States is also a mediator. It is a biased, yet unbiased, involved mediator providing good services, not only militarily, not only economically, and we'll talk about that in a second, but it also plays a significant role in facilitating Arab-Israeli peace. And you can talk about Egypt, Jordan, the Abraham Accords, but also the Palestinians. Despite the fact that the Oslo Accords in the early 1990s were signed without the United States involvement, the United States was the guarantor and kind of the provider of some of the benefits and some of the assurances that eventually allowed the process to move forward. The United States provides significant economic aid to the state of Israel. Adjusted for inflation, since 1948, the United States provided approximately $300 billion, according to one report. The annual amount currently is $3.8 billion, as stipulated in a 10-year memorandum of understanding that was signed in 2019. A previous one was signed in 2010. Most of it was earmarked for Israel's qualitative military edge that I already mentioned, but there were plenty of loans and grants over the years. The U.S. total goods trade with Israel is an estimated $37 billion in 2024. The exports to Israel were about $14.8 billion, up almost 6% from 2023. And we talked about military aid, and it sounds kind of redundant, but the United States has supported specific, advanced, top-of-the-line, cutting-edge weapon system, including Israel's cooperative military missile defense programs to include Iron Dome, David Sling, and Arrow, all protective. You can see one photo on the top right-hand side of the screen in front of you now. It has access to top-of-the-line fighter aircraft such as F-35, Black Hawk helicopters, and on and on and on. The United States and Israel share intelligence closely, intimately. They coordinate. They also cooperate in military operations, both kinetic or conventional, as well as in the cyber domain. Stuxnet is one example. This idea that you can undermine Iran's nuclear program by infecting it with a virus. It was something that was created in cooperation between the United States and Israel, was planted in the centrifuges in Iran, and it kind of destroyed at least some capacity to enrich uranium at the time. They conduct military exercises regularly. They host each other as part of ongoing mutual learning tradition, where experience is exchanged to achieve greater military efficacy. Now, over the years, there were several recent history, perhaps, several challenges to the relationship. One is that in 2011, the Obama administration, after a decade long, almost a decade long of wars in the Middle East, decided that the more significant, the more important domain of strategic interest is actually the Asia Pacific, and specifically East Asia, where China is rising and posing a more significant risk to long-term American interests. He wanted to cut off or reduce dramatically the American footprint in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, shift attention as well as resources to East Asia to try and contain the rise of China. That was facilitated to a large extent by American energy independence. The United States has been extremely vulnerable and sensitive to the flow of oil from the Middle East since the ending of the Second World War. But during the early 2010s, the United States has become significantly more energy independent. It was less vulnerable. It was less sensitive to regional instability. It was less concerned about that. And so there was kind of a mindset that we can do without the Middle East. Certainly, if you downgrade the presence of U.S. military forces in the region. The production of natural gas and domestic extraction of oil replaced OPEC to some extent. The United States is a net exporter of natural gas, certainly in energy, has done quite well. Another element that kind of prevents or challenges some aspects of the special relationship is kind of the perception that Israeli democracy is in danger, that is somewhat in decline. This was especially evident since January 2023 during what is known as the judicial overhaul or reform. But there were earlier echoes to that nevertheless. It is perceived by some in the United States, especially in the Democratic Party, especially in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, for example, that Israel has become less liberal, more religious, and more socially restrictive in that regard. Something that does not align necessarily with their perception or their understanding of what Israel is, certainly from a historical perspective. I'll talk about that in greater detail, but Israel has become also a partisan issue in American politics, especially since 2015, when Israeli Prime Minister gave a speech to a joint session of Congress criticizing the Obama administration's deal with Iran. He came over to Washington, D.C., did not coordinate the visit with the White House, came at the invitation of the Speaker of the House. It was facilitated by the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, at the time. Many people, both within the White House as well as within the Democratic Party, felt that this was a step too far. It makes Israel come across as a partisan issue rather than a bipartisan one. Over the years, Trump made several comments about the Democratic Party and its relations to Israel. In March 2024, for example, he said that any Jewish person that votes for the Democrats hates their religion. They hate everything about Israel, and they should be ashamed of themselves. And during Netanyahu's speech in Congress in July 2024, about one half of Democratic legislators boycotted the speech, which tells you something. There's also a question of the next generation of Americans, especially those young Americans, and to what extent they are connected to and supportive of the State of Israel. In March 2023, for example, Gallup found that the Democratic sympathy in the Middle East now lie more with the Palestinians than with the Israelis, 49 as opposed to 38%. There was a clear generational gap there. Israel saw a net positive sympathy level of plus 46% among baby boomers, born between 1946 and 1964, and 32% among Generation X, born between 1965 and 1979. However, there was a massive drop-off among millennials born between 1980 and 2000s, where the net sympathy for Israel versus Palestinians was negative 2%. We can talk more about young American Jews, 1835, I'll do that a bit later, and their attitudes towards Israel, but there was kind of there's an issue there as well. One argument is that all is well, while others emphasize a sense of either indifference, given there are more pressing issues at home, or outright hostility towards Israel, given the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, more than anything else. Let's kind of switch gears and talk about kind of the more recent history of the relationship, so to speak. And this is a major debate. We hosted an event a couple of weeks ago at the University of Maryland, and the speakers kind of debated whether Biden was supportive of Israel or not as supportive of Israel as he could have been, or was he a hindrance or an obstacle of sorts. But I would argue that for the most part, despite the debates, despite the exchange, I would argue that his fundamental commitment to Israel was never in doubt. We can talk about policy preferences or his advice or what he wanted to see in Israel and in the Gaza Strip after the horrible attack of October 7th, 2023. But for the most part, he was extremely, extremely friendly to the state of Israel. And again, this is only 3 days after this horrible attack. And he says unequivocally, we stand with Israel. It's as simple as that. There was no question from his perspective. He made a very interesting comment towards the end of October 23, where he said, I don't believe you have to be a Jew to be a Zionist, and I am a Zionist. It's a very strong, very memorable comment, especially given some of the conversations that we had in American media, certainly on campuses, about Zionism and what does it mean. But from an American perspective, for an American president to come and say, I am a Zionist, that is a very strong, I would say, comment to make. But nevertheless, there were some critical points of friction between the Biden administration that kind of reflected broader trends, if you'd like, in the two countries, in the way they engage one another. First of all, there's a strategic dimension that has been diverging for a lot of time now. The United States and Israel kind of forged the relationship during the Cold War, as I said, but what happens during the post-Cold War era? During the 1990s, Israel was slightly more expendable, less necessary, less critical for U.S. strategic interest in the region. It kind of commits some kind of a comeback in the early 2000s after 9/11, where Israel and the United States find themselves fighting terrorism. Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Ariel Sharon, said, your war or your conflict or your campaign is our campaign, and vice versa. More recently, the divergent interests manifested themselves in the question of the day after. What do you do in Gaza? What do you expect to achieve in Gaza? What is your goal there? It is perceived by many in the American administration, certainly during the Biden administration, during the first term in office, as an impediment. It is preventing full normalization with Saudi Arabia. Why? Because the Israelis currently are, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu refuses to say that he is willing to accommodate the idea, for example, of a Palestinian state. They disagree oftentimes about Iran's nuclear program. We saw the joint session back in 2015 where Benjamin Netanyahu gives this very controversial, some would argue divisive speech. But also now is the only way to make sure that Iran does not acquire nuclear weapons through diplomacy or through military means. This is something that both Israel and the United States now don't see eye to eye necessarily. We'll talk about that in a moment. As I said, there's a focus on China in East Asia for the most part, certainly both Biden and Obama. But there's also a focus on Eastern Europe and the Baltics, now with Ukraine, that is catching the attention. And we've all seen the footage and the recording and the videos from the White House from the meeting with Zelensky a couple of weeks ago. And again, the United States wishes overall to disengage, for the most part, from the Middle East for a variety of reasons. And this is something that both Biden and Trump share for the most part. And this is something that I find very interesting. Joe Biden, when he visited Israel, comes to counsel Benjamin Netanyahu. And he says, don't do the same mistakes that we did. Don't respond from the guts. Think about it. We made mistakes. They wanted to focus on a diplomatic resolution of the conflict, whereas Israel wanted to use, for the most part, massive military means to destroy Hamas and prevent Hamas from ever emerging as a viable political as well as military actor in the Gaza Strip. And there's a bunch of quotes that I can show you that kind of support this divergence in strategic orientation. How do you solve the Gaza problem? How do you solve the Gaza challenge? Skip. I see we're running out of time. There's a lot of mistrust between the two. There was a lot of mistrust between the two leaders. And this is in response to a question by a journalist or by a reporter. After Benjamin Netanyahu crafted a deal for a ceasefire and hostage release, he kind of then reneged and pedaled back, so to speak. Biden was very disappointed because he announced this plan as if it was his. And in response to a question of a reporter, he says, well, there's very reason for people to draw the conclusion that Netanyahu is prolonging the war for his own political reasons. There was no strategic imperative from his perspective, in his view. As I said, there's a very strong value-based elements kind of cementing the relationship between these two countries. And it was very evident in the first half of 2023 that something is moving, certainly from Biden's perspective, in the wrong direction. First of all, Benjamin Netanyahu chose to appoint Itamar Ben-Gvir, a very ultra-right-wing, radical right-wing political figure in Israeli history, nominated him to be the Minister of National Security or the Minister of Police, as it was known previously. In a way, he was normalizing this right-wing, Kahanist, very nationalist approach and made it part and parcel of the Israeli government. The judicial reform and overhaul that I mentioned earlier tried to increase the power and influence of the executive branch over the legislature as well as the Supreme Court. Israel came across, at least from the Biden administration's perspective, as a very fragile democracy that is almost on the verge of collapse. That there's some kind of a faulty circuit that is short-circuiting the Israeli democratic values that were basis of the relationship between the two. And last but not least, when the ICC and ICJ provided their rulings and their warrants, that kind of raised a number of red flags for the American administration, although they supported and protected and defended the Israeli leaders. At the same time, they were critical of the implications of some of these comments that were made by the courts, the international courts, and some of the negative detrimental implications of arrest warrants against Israeli leaders. And again, there's a bunch of quotes that kind of emphasizes that, including one where Biden says, well, I know all the Israeli governments since the time of Golda Meir, this is the most radical, this is the most extreme one, for example. Again, there's a bunch of quotes to support that argument. Israel has become or transformed itself from a bipartisan issue to something that is much more partisan, as I said earlier. The turning point is probably 2015, where things kind of became extremely visible, noticeable. Although there were some indications prior to that, I'll show you a couple of slides in a moment. But certainly the idea that Israel is a partisan issue is counterproductive and undermines the basic logic of this special relationship, that it's beyond politics. It's not about Democrats and Republicans. The United States and Israel are special friends, close friends, intimate friends, which is no longer the case, I would argue, to a large extent at least. And this began with Benjamin Netanyahu hosting Mitt Romney back in 2012 during his bid for elections, during the presidential elections, my apologies. It is the close relationship that he had with Joe John Boehner here. It is the speech that he made to Congress. As I said, Democrats boycotted about half of them in the more recent in 2024, but at the time, some Democrats also boycotted the speech at the time. Benjamin Netanyahu was also, to a large extent, involved in the 2016 elections and his own elections. He aligned himself quite tightly, quite intimately, one would say, from a political perspective, obviously, with Donald Trump, running for office back in 2016 and then back in 2020. It says in Hebrew, Netanyahu Liga Acheret. Netanyahu is on a different or his own league, so to speak. And on the right-hand side, you can see, for example, Ribonut, do it right. Sovereignty or annexation, essentially, do it right. No to a Palestinian state. The usage of Trump as an image was something that made, at least on the surface, on the face of it, kind of Israel a partisan issue in American politics. And although they met back in 2016, it was quite clear that Benjamin Netanyahu preferred Trump to win at the time. He had an open score, if you like, with Hillary Clinton, certainly with Bill Clinton, and it was pretty clear who's his preferred next president in 2016 was. He also, towards the end of Trump's first term in office, hosted Mike Pompeo, as you can see on the lower left-hand side of the screen. In other words, both in the United States, but certainly from an Israeli perspective, Israel has become more and more, or gradually, increasingly, more of a partisan issue. And last but not least, we can talk about Gen Z, 18, 35 years old, in American public opinion that has been shifting as well, certainly during the war in Gaza since October 23. You can see the decline in sympathy. This is Gallup from February, just a month ago. It is increasing while sympathies towards the Palestinians is increasing. And you can see the bipartisanship there. You can see that Democrats, supposedly, their sympathies lie more with the Palestinians than with the Israelis, as opposed to the Republicans, who still maintain a very robust sense of sympathy towards the state of Israel. And if you dig even deeper, and this is from early 2024, so a year ago or so, you can see that younger Americans are likely to favor military aid to Israel. They are more supportive of humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians. And they sympathize more with the Palestinians than older Americans do, which is a very interesting phenomenon. More data that I can show you, I can bombard you with numbers. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to try to move forward. And again, you saw it during the presidential elections, this uncommitted campaign in Michigan, in Minnesota, and certainly some of the things that you've seen on campuses, some of the campuses here in the United States kind of reflect this idea that younger folks, the younger generation, is more concerned or more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause than it is to the Israelis. So what can we expect? What do we see so far from Trump? And I'll be kind of very brief about that. There are basically 3 points that are kind of sticky points between these two administrations. One is Gaza. What do we do now? How do we move to the future? The second one is Iran's nuclear program. Trump, for example, reimposed his maximum pressure campaign, but at the same time is trying to flirt, so to speak, diplomatically with the Iranian regime. There was a report that he said he had sent a letter. There's also a question of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And what is the role of the Palestinian state? Is there a component that is mandatory, that is required, or not? In that sense, Trump is very difficult to read. You can make an argument that there's logic in his policy, but sometimes there's too many conflicting views expressed by both the president and his senior advisors and officials. He issued a very controversial plan a couple of weeks ago, gave a green light to resume the war, but also engaged in direct conversation, direct talks with Hamas, bypassing the Israeli government just a couple of days ago. He reintroduced sanctions against Iran, but as I said, had sent a letter to the Iranian supreme leader and made comments about the need for a diplomatic arrangement nevertheless. How do you reconcile the two? Is it part and parcel of the same strategy? Difficult to say. He wants to make a deal with the Saudis based on his Abraham Accords achievements from early 2020, but Riyadh says this will not fly without an Israeli commitment to the two-state solution, to the creation of a Palestinian independent state. How do you align that with Trump's Riviera vision for the Gaza Strip, which complicates the situation? So we have kind of internal contradictions that, in a way, perhaps you can make the argument that serve a certain strategic goal, but it sends kind of a wrong signal or mixed signals, so to speak. And the Israelis are observing this scene very closely because they are extremely concerned. An opinion piece earlier today for the Times of Israel basically argued or tried to raise the question whether Israel will be the next Ukraine, whether Israel will be sacrificed for some kind of rapprochement, some kind of an accommodation between Russia, Israel, between Russia and the United States, or the United States and Iran. Alrighty. So what does that mean? Well, the two countries share a formidable past and a challenging present and an uncertain future, so to speak. It's a bit too opaque. There are still major common interests, especially in the military and intelligence side. There are major incongruent interests, especially in the regional context, the Israeli-Palestinian, Arab-Israeli context especially. The Israeli body politics is changing dramatically before our eyes. Shared values, commitment to liberal democracy, and so on and so forth, while the American body politics is also undergoing major changes. What does it mean? Israel, as I said, might become a hindrance for Trump's policies. Kind of a replay of the Zelensky meeting in the White House might happen between Benjamin Netanyahu and Trump, nevertheless. He's a very transactional and much less ideological individual, certainly compared to Biden. And I assume that we will face in the coming days some significant turbulence. We saw some indications about this when Adam Boehler, who's Trump's hostage envoy, had a very different take on the relationship with Hamas. And the big question, and I'll finish with that, will the interest-based framework, if we assume that all else does not serve any purpose anymore, will that be enough to maintain a normal bilateral relationship between the two countries or not? Thank you so much, and I apologize for taking a bit more time than anticipated.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Saltzman. That was a very comprehensive and far-reaching course. I feel like we got maybe a whole semester in 40 minutes. In fact, there was concern that the slides were going so fast that somebody was frustrated that they couldn't follow. And I want to reassure everyone that this lecture will be posted on our website, chaimitzvah.org, and you will get it as an email with the follow-up source sheet soon. So you'll have a chance to go through it at your own pace, but that was really, really comprehensive and terrific. I think people were so enthralled that they forgot to populate a lot of questions because there was so much there. But there is a question from David Spiel. He says, in light of the recent abandonment of support of Ukraine on the part of the United States government, despite previously expressed unwavering commitment, do you think that Israel has valid concerns? Do you think Israel has valid concerns of American abandoning the support? So are you, from your analysis of all this, do you think that Israel could possibly be in the same boat as Ukraine? Or given the historical background that you did speak about in the very beginning, is it really on a different level, this history with Israel?
David, this is a brilliant question, and I would go with Audrey's kind of the second part of her comment. I think that there's a major difference between the relationship between Israel and the United States and the United States and Ukraine, and this is the past dependence. There was a strong, robust historical past that is shared by both countries. There's a robust presence of American Jews here in the United States, obviously. There's a robust institutional framework that is shared by both Israel and the United States. They have been, quote unquote, in bed, quote unquote, for a longer period of time and in a more robust way. So it seems very unlikely that the United States will abandon Israel, as Trump perhaps did just a couple of weeks ago in the White House during that meeting, cutting off aid, the commentary, if you'd like, or the nature of the language that was used both by President Trump as well as J.D. Vance, the vice president. It was very confrontational, very much belittling and diminishing. The emphasis on say thank you or something was very, very visible. So I don't see that happen, but I can totally see the United States, certainly the Trump administration, pushing Israel to accept whatever the vision of the president is and using a lot of leverage towards that objective. I can totally see that. So not cutting off aid altogether as the United States did with Ukraine, but certainly applying significant pressure. And I think that the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu understands that. I think he's much more sophisticated and understanding of Trump than Zelensky was at the time, for different reasons, perhaps. Zelensky was in a very difficult spot, literally in a very robust military conflict. Israel is not in that sense in the same position. It is not in danger of being completely overtaken by an external actor as Russia threatens Ukraine.
So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. Your lecture was very descriptive, uh, and I'm going to ask you to put on your prophecy hat, perhaps, or what. So what would you suggest, given this complex dance and dynamic between Israel and the United States and the historical bonds we have? And the fact that that we all are very concerned about the next generation who will be the future leaders. What two or three kinds of prescriptions do you have to assure that we will have a good future for Israel and the United States?
It's a brilliant question. Once again, both you and David asked very good and very powerful questions, very complicated questions. I'll try to kind of provide a sensible answer nevertheless. I think that one way is to make sure that the channels of communication are open at all times. I think that one of the main problems, certainly that we've seen in the interaction between Trump and President Zelensky, was that it was all done in front of the media. And I think that not only you need to converse with one another, something that happens all the time, but it shouldn't happen in broad daylight, so to speak. There's some added value. There's a lot of sense of disagreeing, and it's inevitable. But let's do it behind closed doors, because that kind of projects and reflects on the relationship and makes it more difficult to sustain. I think, on the other hand, both countries need to understand that sometimes they will disagree, and sometimes these disagreements will be of paramount importance. That they will disagree on the shape of the region, on the future of the Palestinian people, on the political architecture in the region, on the role that the United States will play in future regional politics. And I think that the Israelis are now scrambling, like the Europeans to a large extent, to try and figure out what Trump wants. And to some extent, how do you mitigate that? The Europeans apparently are going their own way. They're going to try to create their own security or defense infrastructure to try and live without the United States in Europe as a provider of European security. Israel is not there, as I said, but certainly needs to think outside the box and try to contemplate what they want to do. You're absolutely right. Benjamin Netanyahu is prime minister, the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history, more than David Ben-Gurion. But it seems likely that this will not last forever, and perhaps his uh, removal from the political scene will open a new setting or a new landscape for new ideas in Israeli politics. The social contract between Israelis is now being challenged as a result of the war in Gaza. There's going to be a lot of changes happening in the coming year or two, certainly if commission of inquiry will be established in Israel that will find Prime Minister Netanyahu culpable one way or another.
Okay, so now we have a flood of questions. Um, well, let's go with Maya Bloom's. Mia Bloom's.
Uh,
She's a she spoke a little bit. So she's asking. Well, she's asking about Trump again. His long-term desire to avoid foreign entanglements. How should Israel play their cards there? And so also. Are you concerned about his affiliation with some what she calls deplorables at Mar-a-Lago? Is that in Israel's best interest as well? Perhaps Trump is more of a liability. What's your take on that?
Well, from the classical saying in politics, it is better the devil you know, in a sense. And I think that Trump is so unpredictable that it's very difficult to read his mind and the kind of the policies or the vision that he has for whatever topic is discussed. I think that to a large extent, Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to hug Trump as much as he possibly can to avoid any daylight between the two countries. I think he understands the way to get into Trump's heart and mind, perhaps, if you wish. He understands the transactional nature of the relationship, perhaps not fully. Perhaps there's a learning curve, but certainly he understands what needs to be done. The only question is whether he's willing to pay the political price necessary to accommodate Trump's demands if and when these will emerge, especially in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, especially the need to create a Palestinian state if and when Saudi-Israeli normalization is back on the table. And I think that this is something that Trump wants very much. He wants a Nobel Peace Prize for a variety of reasons. One is to stick it to President Obama, who got it without any merit from his perspective. He wants to make peace. He said that multiple times, even when Benjamin Netanyahu was visiting the White House. He wants to be the man of peace. He wants to build on the Abraham Accords, and in order to expand the Abraham Accords, Israel would have to pay in one way or another in acknowledging or talking more seriously about the prospects of a Palestinian state. So this is something that Trump will insist on heavily, and this might bring us to a kind of a Ukraine moment, kind of a Zelensky moment in the White House or over the phone. Or perhaps Benjamin Netanyahu will understand and just acquiesce beforehand, before he reaches that point.
So in the end of the day, how dependent going into the future was Israel on the United States?
Heavily dependent, I would argue. There were some people in the Israeli political setting, including Benjamin Netanyahu, who played with the idea of giving up the military and economic aid provided by the United States in order to increase Israeli autonomy or independence and try to relinquish all the shackles that come with the special relationship. The idea that you can't embarrass the United States, you can't go about doing your own thing without coordinating with the Americans. But in fact, if you look at it from a political perspective, from a diplomatic perspective, without the United States, Israel will have a very difficult times in a number of ways, including in the United Nations, in the Security Council. Access to American military capabilities is more valuable now than ever before, especially given the kind of the detrimental outcomes of the war in Gaza in that regard, because Israel is directly or not kind of boycotted when it comes to access to military capabilities. Former providers such as France and the UK have imposed all kinds of limitations. They may rely on themselves more now than ever before, or to try and reclaim some of its military production base at home. But again, the United States is so advanced, so uh, 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 the cutting edge technology exists here, and it will be virtually impossible to decouple from the United States militarily, economically, politically, and so on and so forth.
There are so many questions, and this is something we even haven't touched on. And so I'm definitely, we definitely need you back for a second discussion. But so Rebecca asks, why has Israel aligned itself with Russia instead of Ukraine? Isn't this antithetical to their values?
Yeah, so we can distinguish between two main periods. At the beginning of the war, the Israeli government was extremely hesitant to align itself with Ukraine because it was fearful of retribution by the Putin regime. It was mostly concerned about Russian-speaking Jews in Russia, and it didn't want to burn all the bridges, so to speak, and kind of endanger them one way or another. But as Putin became much more aggressive on the battleground, as the United States was pouring more and more capabilities, as the Russians began cooperating with the Iranians, for example, in the areas of drones and other missile technology, Israel started kind of punishing the Russians for that more than it did before, not offensively, but certainly to provide defense systems to the Ukrainians, or at least sharing some of the know-how nevertheless. So it was not, it was the Israeli prime minister at the time, Naftali Bennett, was supposedly mediating between the Russians and the Ukrainians at one point in time. And his interest was, how do you make sure that the situation on the ground does not escalate further, both for the Jewish communities in Ukraine, the Jewish community in Russia, but also in Syria. There was kind of a Russian playground of sort. Russia provided significant defense capabilities, air missile defense systems, and supporting some of the activities on the ground on behalf of Hezbollah and the Syrian regime as well.
Okay. So we only have 2 minutes left. So in 1 minute, do you have anything that you'd like to leave us with until we see you again?
Oh, first of all, I'm delighted to be here, and I'd be delighted to join you guys again in the future, obviously. I'll just say this. It is a very interesting and extremely dynamic topic. I encourage you, strongly encourage you to read more, to follow the news, because one constant in the Middle East is that it is ever changing. There's always something happening, especially now when you have so many tectonic movements in the region, as well as in Europe, and especially here in the United States with the Trump 2.0 administration. So I can assure you, it will not be boring moving forward. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Saltzman, for your insightful and comprehensive presentation tonight. Our next lecture will be Dr. Barak Mendelson. The topic will be Friends or Foe, the Complex Relationship Among Jihadi Groups. Please join us on Wednesday, March 26th at 7 p.m. So that's Wednesday, March 26th at 7 p.m. And you will get the recording of this lecture. And please know it'll also be posted on our website, along with all the lectures we've done so far. And thank you so much, and we'll see you again. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Good night.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.